Hello, welcome to Lecture 16 of Introduction to the Sikhs. In this lecture, I'll talk about Sikhs in California and provide some more details about the community in California and also scholarship with respect to the community. The detailed look at Sikhs in California, of course, relies on and builds on several of the themes that I introduced at the beginning of the lecture on global migration. Just a very brief excursion into U.S. immigration policy, and I referenced a little bit of this in talking about Bhagat Singh Thind in the last lecture. There's a history of attempts to deal with immigration. The modern debates are just the modern version of a long line of these pushes and pulls on who should come into the United States and what their status should be. Of course, some of the earliest non-white immigrants were from Japan and China. Many Chinese came to work on the railroads, and again, they were viewed as a threat, demonized, and that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The entry of South Asian immigrants, particularly Sikhs, led to the passing of the Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917, and that was tightened. That exclusion was tightened with the Immigration Act of 1924. In some cases, these acts have different names based on the sponsors and so on. So I've used various terms, but this is not meant to be legally comprehensive. The Nye-Lee Act of 1935 actually allowed a little bit of liberalization, and similarly, the Magnuson Act and Luce-Seller Act of 1943 and 46 led to some attempts to rationalize, liberalize, and similarly, the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952. But these were mostly marginal changes, sometimes tightening, sometimes a little loosening. The attempt was mostly to keep out non-whites, so keep their numbers to a very small number. In some cases, they loosened up restrictions on naturalization for non-whites who were already in the United States. A major milestone, though, was the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. And I think it's arguable that this was partly a response to the Cold War, where the United States wanted to project itself as a symbol of freedom and hope, as opposed to the Soviet Union. And so the attempt here was to remove some of the worst racial discrimination aspects of U.S. immigration law, and this actually created the framework, which is more or less in practice today. What is interesting is that this act, when it was submitted to Congress, the Secretary of State at the time, Dean Rusk, tried to reassure members of Congress that this would have very limited impacts on the number of migrants. For example, suggesting that the number of migrants from India or the countries of South Asia would just be a few thousand a year at the most. In practice, numbers increased dramatically, especially from the 1990s, both through family reunification and through the U.S.'s need for skilled immigration, particularly in the tech sector, and particularly around Y2K, which was the threat of collapse of legacy software systems when the new millennium was looming. It's precisely this current immigration system which is being rolled back in various ways by the current U.S. government as of 2020. And aside from all of what we're seeing in terms of cages and police military presence at the border, a lot of the restrictions on immigration are being implemented through different bureaucratic procedures, just slowing down processes and increasing rates of denial of naturalization and so on. So in some sense, what we're seeing is a reprise of the very exclusionary approach to immigration that thrived in the early part of the 20th century. In California, there were also very specific laws on top of the immigration laws. The California Alien Land Law of 1913 was designed to prevent non-whites from owning land in California. This was strengthened in 1920 and again in 1923. It was finally invalidated in 1952, found to be unconstitutional finally in 1952. And there were also interracial marriage laws in California. They went back all the way to 1850 when California became a state. And of course, that was this is before the Civil War. This is very much a part of the racial culture of the United States at that time. Even though California was a free state, it had these laws prohibiting interracial marriage, and those were only repealed in 1948. It was in this context then that we can talk about the Sikh community in California. And there are interestingly several studies, book-length studies of Sikhs in California. By far the most significant, I think, is that by Bruce Labrack, a very comprehensive study of the Sikhs of Northern California, looking at their entire history, but unfortunately it stops in 1975. It took a long time to publish. It was only published in 1988. And there's definitely, I think, the need for a further look at the community, at the history of the last 4 decades. Laura Hirvi, I think a scholar from Finland, did another study which looked at Sikh immigrants in California and compared them to Sikh immigrants in Finland, her home country, and looked at how they navigated their identities in the two different locations. And that, I think, comparison is kind of interesting. But again, her samples are relatively small, and it's a much less comprehensive look than Bruce Labrack's. And so I don't think it really serves the purpose of providing a modern study of the Sikh community in California. Within the United States, I should mention that maybe about a sixth of the maybe about 10% of the Indian American community or Asian Indian community in the United States are Sikhs, so much higher than their percentage in the country of India, which is only 2%. They've had a higher propensity to migrate. But in California, I think they are an even higher percentage, and about half of the national Sikh population in the United States is in California. We only can guess based on U.S. Census data on language spoken, so it's based mostly on Punjabi speakers. But after the 2020 census, we might have a better count. The other two books that I want to mention and that I will focus on, in particular, Margaret Gibson's book, which I think, like Bruce Labrack's book, Margaret Gibson's book has not received as much attention as it should have. Gibson was actually a faculty member at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where I am. And in 1988, she published a book called Accommodation Without Assimilation, Sikh Immigrants in an American High School. And here you can see the opposition of accommodation and assimilation, which I talked about in my previous lecture. And you can see the use of Sikh as defining the community in the title, and that's very important. Karen Leonard's book is much more specific, much more historical. she looks at a very specific community of just a few hundred people, what she calls California's Punjabi Mexican Americans. And certainly the community often identified itself as Punjabi Mexican. But the composition of the community at that time was very similar to what Margaret Gibson looked at, basically about 90% Sikh, and the other 10% of the Punjabis being Hindu and Muslim. And her Karen Leonard's title is also very revealing, making ethnic choices as compared to Gibson's accommodation without assimilation. So I will contrast these two viewpoints later in this lecture. Karen Leonard relied a lot actually on Bruce LeBrac's prior study and his fieldwork. And her own, this was something she looked at pretty much in isolation. Her other work was actually much more on Hyderabadi Muslims, Muslims from the city of Hyderabad in India. And again, Leonard's work was done in the early 80s, even though it was published in 1992. So again, the fieldwork for these studies is 3 or 4 decades old. Here's some photographs of the Punjabi Mexican community, and as I've said, I've chosen to call them Sikhs and Mexicans because 90% of them were Sikhs. You'll see that in a couple of these photographs, the Sikh men have cut their hair, and this was sometimes in response to their marrying Mexican Catholic wives, and this was some of the pressure of assimilation that was not only a function of the white society around them, but the desires of the Mexican wives to fit into their culture. So a little bit of background: interracial marriage was prohibited, but again, in the rather strange racial categories, everybody brown was considered to be equal, so Sikhs and Mexicans marrying each other was fine. In some cases, the Mexicans were citizens, and so that actually was it was a practical matter because the men could not own land. There were these land laws which prohibited them from owning land. They were not citizens, but the land could be in the wife's name. In these cases, from reading the accounts of this community, one knows that the major influence on the children of these communities was from the maternal culture. The children were typically brought up as Catholics with Christian first names and went to church. But sometimes the wives would, for example, cook Punjabi food for the husbands. And again, there are probably some superficial similarities between Mexican and Punjabi food. It's also documented that the men did have their own community of Punjabis, and the men would meet each other, and occasionally, maybe a handful of times a year or just a couple of times a year, the entire family would, say, go up for a weekend for a major festival to the Stockton Gurdwara. Most of this community was in the Imperial Valley near the Mexican border, and this was the region that also elected Dalip Singh Sond as the congressperson. Two of the photos show wives or descendants of these Sikh Mexican or Punjabi Mexican families. One is a group photo, and the other is of an individual. She's posing in front of photos of her family. And a lot of these photos are actually from archives of Punjabi pioneers maintained at UC Davis and were collected by a gentleman named T.S. Sibia, who created the archive. The last photo in the middle of the bottom of the screen is actually an anomaly, and I've left it here to explain something about the nature of research into this community. So this photograph is actually featured on websites concerning the Sikh Mexican or Punjabi Mexican community. But actually it turns out that the man in this photograph, Poona Singh, was actually married to a Punjabi Sikh woman. And what you see here is him posing with all of his children. And so originally when I came across this photograph, I thought it was an exception where the head of the household, the Sikh head of the household, had maintained his beard and turban while marrying a Mexican wife. But that's not the case. And indeed, this is a family that was purely Punjabi in that sense. So you can see that the children have adapted much more. So I think this is a very interesting community. It's been somewhat assimilated into the wider community, and a lot of this is now just history. But I think looking at this community and how it evolved has some lessons for thinking about what it means to be American in the contemporary sense. And here I'd like to now present the contrasting views. The view of Karen Leonard is that the initial Punjabi diaspora really did not have a very strong Sikh identity, and they were they easily assimilated and adapted and so on. And she decides to call them cosmopolitans, borrowing from this Eurocentric literature. As I hinted at in my previous lecture, I think this is based on a misunderstanding of Sikh history. While the region of Punjab that these migrants came from was very much multicultural, the individual identities were relatively well formed. Muslims recognized themselves as Muslims, Hindus as Hindus, Sikhs as Sikhs. There were, of course, there were some shared cultural practices. There was some mutual respect for each other's traditions and even sharing of each other's traditions among all three communities. And this reflected the kind of coexistence. But it's not the kind of assimilative cosmopolitanism that Karen Leonard imagines. And her work is based on other scholars, I think, who have not really understood the history of the Sikhs in Punjab in the late 19th and early 20th century. And again, this goes back to, I think, some misreadings of not only the Singh Sabha movement, but also misreadings of Sikh history from the time of Guru Gobind Singh. So these are scholarly debates, perhaps, but they're very important for the Sikh community because it really wants to be recognized as an individual community. Some of this came up in debates about how to include South Asians in the California schools curriculum, social sciences curriculum, where Hindu nationalists were arguing for the use of the term South Asian, which is very generic, but actually quite ahistorical because South Asia is also a term which has been applied by modern scholars. And Sikhs were very insistent that they be recognized as Sikhs. Karen Leonard, without, I think, adequate justification, proposed using the term Punjabi, but as I've argued, Punjabi really misses key aspects of the identity of this community, which was 90% Sikh. Margaret Gibson, in her analysis, in the title of the book, she's very clear that she's talking about Sikhs, but then in her text, she typically uses Punjabi because, as she notes, there were a few Hindu families in her sample, and therefore it's easier for her to use Punjabi. But again, as I'll show you, all the concerns that she's highlighting are really concerns about Sikh immigrants with respect to accommodation, assimilation, and acculturation. So Margaret Gibson's study was done in a community which she disguises as Valleyside, but I think is actually the town of Yuba City, which is north of Sacramento and represents a major concentration of the Sikh community in the Central Valley of California. What she describes is a community that really wants to fit in, but also wants to maintain its identity to the extent that it decides it wants to maintain its identity, rather than being pressured or bullied or forced into abandoning its heritage. And I think this is the point that Karen Leonard completely misses in her book and subsequent analysis. By the way, her subsequent analysis in 2007 was not based on any fresh field work. So she was really relying on her description of the community from the 1920s and 30s. So Margaret Gibson is looking at the community in the late 70s, early 80s. Again, it's a particular site, so it's not as comprehensive as Bruce Lebrac's, but what Gibson describes, I think, is very important for our discussion. So because Gibson is an educationalist, somebody who studies the education system, and in particular immigrants within the education system, her focus in this study is on high school students, and she really notes that there are differences between parents who have typically migrated and as adults, and their children who either came as very young children or were born in the United States. And so the students are more open to acculturation, to adopting Western culture than their parents, but they both agree that, again, it should be a matter of choice, and that the Sikh community, young or old, should not be forced into assimilation by the prejudices of the majority population. Again, Margaret Gibson has a lot of very interesting ethnography where she talks to the contemporary white students of this high school. And so she's able to, I think, document things which I think Karen Leonard could have if she had looked at the newspaper accounts of the time. But Margaret Gibson is able to document it in terms of very direct attitudes attitudes directly expressed by the white students, whom Margaret Gibson calls Valleysider students. So the white students basically say, well, there's no problem with these Punjabi students, but the parents in particular note the negative social climate and the negative impact it has on their children's development. While this is all from almost 4 decades ago, I think there is evidence of some of these kinds of situations still prevailing. It's one of the reasons for having a school curriculum which educates younger children before high school about the Sikh community and its identity and values. And I think it's therefore very important for scholars to recognize the problematics of how they label the Sikh community. So in fact, here's a very direct quote from Margaret Gibson. She says, Valleysider students said they believed in religious freedom and the right of every individual not to conform, but in practice they penalized those whose standards were different. Sikh students were even pressured to abandon unshorn hair, turban, and steel bangle, all outward marks of their Sikh faith and identity. And here's a quote: "We have numbers on our side," explained one Valleyside senior, a bright, popular student and a class officer. To this Valleysider student, being American meant acting like white people. So this is Margaret Gibson describing the attitudes that she observes and records in her fieldwork. And again, I think these are issues that face contemporary America as well. And I think the struggles of the Sikh community, both as a minority in mostly white America, but also a small minority within the Asian and Indian community, and a minority in their homeland of India, really, I think, gives one some fresh perspectives on how one should think about, one can think and one should think about what it means to be American. Here's a few photographs, some older, some more contemporary. The photograph on the left and at the bottom, the black and white photos are from definitely before the Second World War. And these are Sikh farmers, often working as laborers, sometimes landowners, or sometimes the land was held by a person acting as a front for them. If they didn't have a wife who was a U.S. citizen, sometimes a trusted white friend would act as the owner of record. Though again, they could be subject to being cheated. The middle top photograph in color is interesting because it shows Sikh women working in the fields, and again, this was very much part of the ethos of Sikhs who started out in the lumber industry, worked their way down to California, and went from lumber to agriculture, and started out as basically migrant farm workers, and looked for opportunities to acquire land, and become part of a more prosperous America. There are still recent Sikh migrants in the Central Valley who still are workers, migrant workers, and often their standards of living are extremely low. And I think this illustrates the fact that what matters often is the external conditions and the time period that has passed since migration, rather than necessarily any distinct religious or cultural traits. So I think attempts to stereotype immigrants in terms of cultural traits are often misleading, because those immigrants have come from poor families or rural areas, or come without any resources, and have been here for only a short period of time. On the right top, you have a picture of Didar Singh Bance, who is probably the richest Sikh farmer in California, maybe one of the richest farmers in California. He came as a migrant worker. I believe he cut his hair and assimilated in order to find work and to be, again, relatively invisible. When he became prosperous, and I think partly as a result of the resurgence of Sikh identity after the Indian government's attacks on the Darbar Sahib in 1984, he resumed his long hair and turban. And below that is his son, Karam Singh Bance, who is now is actively running the farm. And again, there are several very successful farmers like him, especially in the area around Yuba City. Again, I should mention that this resurgence of Sikh identity after 1984 is sometimes confused by scholars as a kind of a novel assertion of Sikh identity. And what I would argue is that actually it goes all the way back to Guru Gobind Singh and the institution of the Khalsa. And there are different pushes and pulls on the Sikh Khalsa identity. But it's misleading to think of it as something that is only a recent aspect of the consciousness of the community. Of course, this community recognizes itself as Punjabi as well, but Sikh and Punjabi, of course, are not exclusive. In fact, they're very complementary identities for most Sikhs. Here are a couple of photographs from Yuba City. These, I think, are from November 2005. And they are an example of how Sikhs have celebrated their heritage. This is a parade, annual parade, that is probably the largest in the Sikh community, though there are several others in the United States. And it takes place in Yuba City every year in November, around the time of Guru Nanak's, the celebration of Guru Nanak's birth. And on the right, you can see the main Gurdwara in Yuba City with a large congregation. Again, you can see the architectural style with the domes and the flagpole with the Nishan Sahib. Here is another California example. This is from Vaisakhi, the harvest festival, which is the first day of the month of Vaisakh in the Indian calendar, and which is the anniversary of the founding of the Khalsa. This is from April 2008. On the left, you can see a Sikh leader, and next to him is actually the mayor of Los Angeles at the time, Antonio Villaraigosa, and he is wearing a turban, and he has a ceremonial scarf as well. So this is an example of how Sikhs have tried to engage with the political establishment. What's interesting in this case, of course, is that the political establishment is himself a representative of an immigrant non-white community. And so there's some other interesting visuals in this picture. The person on the other side of the mayor of Los Angeles is actually the mayor of Amritsar, who happens to be a Hindu. And he's chosen not to wear a turban, but instead to cover his head with a handkerchief. And to his left, to the right of the picture, is actually the deputy mayor of Amritsar, who happens to be a Sikh. Then finally, the right-hand photograph is a Vaisakhi procession in Los Angeles. And this is interesting because you can see a Sikh, an initiated Sikh, a Khalsa Sikh, leading the procession with the sword, the kirpan, followed by another Sikh ceremonially carrying the Guru Granth Sahib on his head, again wrapped with ceremonial cloth. And there's also a ceremonial canopy which is attached to this. So this is a quite interesting way of I think compactly carrying the Guru Granth Sahib. Another way to do it, of course, would be on a float, but in this case, this was perhaps less cumbersome. This is a very interesting photograph, and this is again from Vaisakhi. This was labeled American Sikh Day, and this was a demonstration in Sacramento, the capital of California, in 2011. The purpose of the demonstration was, I think, to ask for some civil rights protections for Sikhs in California. As I've hinted at in other lectures, the issues of wearing turbans in different settings, different occupational settings, and beards, and then also actually carrying kirpans in schools have been issues where Sikhs have requested legislative accommodations and exemptions. So what has always fascinated me about this photograph is the placard that this elderly Sikh man is carrying. It says, "We may have come over on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now." And the author of this quote, the authorship of this quote is ascribed to Whitney Young Jr., who is maybe less well known now, but he was actually a very important part of Martin Luther King's inner circle, and was, for example, instrumental in organizing the March on Washington, I think, in 1963 or so. I've also seen this quote ascribed directly to Martin Luther King Jr., but I think the fact that it's attributed to, and it may actually be even older than either of them, but in this case, and more commonly, it's attributed to Whitney Young Jr. And this, I think, illustrates a couple of points. One, of course, is that we forget people very easily. I think very few people know Whitney Young Jr.'s name now, though Martin Luther King is, of course, very well remembered. But I think the more important point that I want to bring out is that a lot of the ability of Sikhs and their success in obtaining civil rights and religious accommodations is built on the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which was completely motivated by African Americans. So I think this is something that, again, illustrates the fact that Sikhs are one of many minorities in the United States, and ideals of equality and equal treatment under the law transcend any one community. Again, also one can see that there are many different dimensions of equality, whether it's with respect to race or religion or gender, sexuality, and so on. And all of these can raise, complicated issues, legal issues, sometimes moral issues. I think, but very often there's some basic principles of human equality and dignity, which I think should provide a guide to drawing up and enforcing laws. And I think in this case there are some very easy parallels to draw between at least Sikh ideals and these equalities of humanity and justice.